Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on Grid Modernization Part 2. So this webinar was organized by myself, Kerry Garcia, your statewide local government energy efficiency best practices coordinator, and Rick Brown from TerraVerde. So today I will be doing the moderation for this webinar, and I'll give you a quick overview of today's agenda. So first I'll provide a brief intro to the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative for those of you who may not be familiar with the program, and go over some of the webinar logistics, and then to our feature presentation, starting with some impacts of renewables and energy storage, energy efficiency, electrification and fuel switching, microgrids, and finally Prop 39. So just a little bit of background on the coordinator. In the Statewide Energy Efficiency Strategic Plan, the California Public Utilities Commission called for the creation of a coordinator to facilitate statewide focus both in gathering and sharing exemplary policies and practices, and tracking progress of local government energy efficiency and sustainability progress on a statewide level. So as the coordinator, I work closely with the Statewide Energy Efficiency Collaborative, or SEEC, an alliance of 3 statewide NGOs: ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, the Institute for Local Government, and the Local Government Commission, as well as the California's 4 investor-owned utilities. So together we support local governments in their efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy. We do this through a number of different resources and services, such as ICLEI's ClearPath tool, Institute for Local Government's Beacon Recognition Program, and LGC's annual SEEC Forum, and various workshops, webinars, fact sheets, and guides. So these resources are all available to local governments at no cost. And just a few items to highlight: the call for proposals. If you're already subscribed to my weekly update, you've probably seen that. So go ahead and if you have a proposal for the SEEC Forum, we'd love to see it and have it highlighted in the forum. And that'll be hosted here in Sacramento, June 20th through 21st. And registration should be opening by the end of the month for that. So before we get started, I just want to go over a few logistics. Everyone will be muted except for our panelists. Due to the large number of participants, we ask you to type your questions into the question box. But please feel free to submit your questions at any point during the webinar. We'll be summarizing them as we go on, provide more time for Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. So any questions that we don't get to, we'll ask our presenters to respond after the webinar, and we'll share those in a follow-up email. And lastly, this webinar will also be recorded and made available, just like all of our other webinars, on the website along with PowerPoint presentations. So now I'm excited to introduce our presenter, Dr. Rick Brown. Dr. Brown founded TerraVerde in 2009. Since then, he has been deeply involved in California legislation and regulation regarding clean energy, including crafting legislation guiding the development of California's Prop 39 Clean Energy Jobs Act. He has continued to work closely with the Prop 39 Citizen Oversight Board and the California Energy Commission staff to refine and improve Prop 39 program guidelines. He was involved in the passage of SB 585 in 2012, legislation that filled a $400 million gap in solar rebate funding. He also led an effort to have the California Association of School Business Officials, CASBO, select TerraVerde as its energy strategic partner in 2013. And more recently, he has been invited by the CPUC to provide testimony at numerous proceedings, including net energy metering, battery storage rebate programs, and serving disadvantaged communities. So from here, I will let Rick take it away.
Thanks, Kerry. Let me just check. Can everybody hear me? Kerry, can you hear me? That's probably the best answer.
Yeah, I can hear you just fine, Rick.
Great. Well, thanks for that introduction. We'll just jump into it. You know, the primary topic today is grid modernization. And I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background and then talking about sort of what's on the horizon. As many of you may be well aware, the grid, the system of delivery of power throughout California, was principally designed to move power from centralized facilities that have the ability to operate on a continuous basis to homes, businesses throughout the state. But with the implementation of the Renewable Portfolio Standard and the growth of solar and wind over the last 10 to 12 years, the grid with that centralized design is no longer as efficient and effective at managing the flow of power and all the various different needs that are associated with that, and is straining to figure out how to, and policymakers are straining to figure out how to move in a direction where the grid is able to accommodate those both intermittent and more decentralized and distributed sources of energy. One of the key problems is that in doing so, there are various estimates of what the cost of that's going to be, but one cost number based on actually a projection that came out of a report by Southern California Edison a couple years ago could be as much as $150 billion over the next 10 years. And so the question becomes, who's going to pay for that? More recently, with the recent wildfires, and while there has not been a definitive determination of what started those fires, there is clearly some evidence that it possibly could be, transmission and or distribution infrastructure, grid infrastructure, under the stress of high winds, potentially created sources of initial fires that turn into wildfires. The investor-owned utilities, the distribution system operators in California, are looking at significant liabilities associated with owning and operating the grid, new forms of liability. And so all these costs are going to have to be addressed somewhere. And one of the ways that this is being looked at is through what the California Public Utilities Commission is calling its Distributed Energy Resource Action Plan. And this gets to the question of the methodology for modernizing the grid. The traditional method has been to put more wires up, put more substations, transformers, various what we call hardwire devices to create greater flexibility and ability to move power around and balance the various requirements around voltage and frequency and so forth and thermal loading. But more recently, non-wire alternatives, what are known as distributed energy resources as a method of upgrading the grid, are being looked at more closely, primarily because they seem to have the potential of doing so at a significantly lower cost. What we mean by distributed energy resources are things like solar, battery storage, but also devices that are connected to the grid through control, like a Nest thermostat or other kinds of thermostat, a hot water heater that has a communications device, or a refrigerator. The idea here being that if we're having problems balancing the use and production or generation of electricity, we don't necessarily only have to put in more wires and various other kinds of hard assets. With the increased capability of distributed data systems, we can actually put controls on all kinds of devices and moderate when and where and how they operate to help balance the grid. Some of these are known as in front of the meter resources, like a large battery at a substation, and some of them are behind the meter resources. The same kind of battery, but being used by a customer for other purposes, but also making it available in a market to the grid operator and through an aggregation of multiple resources to help meet those needs. So, for example, on February 28th, PG&E released a request for offer into the market, saying that they needed battery storage capacity in 3 local sub-areas around the state. One of which that I'm most familiar with is the Monterey Bay Moss Landing area, because our company has done a good bit of work of implementing solar with a school district in that area. How that RFO was structured is it said developers could either propose batteries located at substations themselves that would be owned by PG&E or under a third-party ownership model, or they could also propose batteries, as I said, behind the meter, where the customer and or developer in partnership with the customer, like the school district I'm talking about, could own that battery and sell that capacity of that battery to PG&E for the purposes of the grid balancing that they needed in that area. Now, the way these RFOs work is that it's like any other kind of request for bid or offer or proposal. There's a certain set of specifications, and then the developer comes back and says, I can provide you X, Y, and Z resource for a particular cost, meeting those specifications. Sometimes those RFOs set out these specifications such that either a front of the meter owned by the utility, in front of the meter through some kind of PPA or third-party ownership arrangement, or behind the meter are evaluated on essentially a level playing field where it's primarily a cost question. Sometimes, however, there are offers where behind the meter is a preferred resource and it is carved out as having a certain amount of capacity that's provided. And the second bullet here, the Southern California Edison has such a carve out for some offers that they're going to be putting out sometime this summer in both the Ventura and Santa Barbara areas. Now, why this is important, besides the sort of geekiness of, grid modernization balancing, is this behind the meter opportunity for local governments and schools and any other kind of public entity creates an opportunity to generate a revenue stream to help offset the cost of those devices. So, for example, in the case of this school district, they're going to be implementing, putting in a battery in combination with an existing solar facility at their operations center, where they have IT and phones and refrigeration for food services and fueling. They've had a problem of the grid going out to that center. I actually got a call on Friday that it had gone out for several hours, and their diesel generator is no longer operating reliably. And so they've decided they're going to put a battery, pair it with the solar they have, put in a microgrid controller, and therefore have a backup capability so that they don't lose the ability to keep that area functioning when the grid goes out, be it for an hour or 2 hours or maybe a couple days. But that battery is going to be sitting there most of the time not being used. And so the district is, with our help, looking for one of these developers to bid that battery along with others they may have into this RFO and generate revenue to the district that will offset its cost of putting that battery in for backup purposes. So this is one example of how local governments, in the effort to support their resiliency efforts, having some backup, or for other reasons, may need to kind of track and get to know more about some of these grid modernization opportunities, these non-wire distributed energy resource models. Okay, I'm going to put that piece to the side for a second and talk a little bit about energy efficiency, but I'm actually going to connect it back to that discussion of grid modernization because, as I mentioned earlier, there are many devices that can be put in to improve energy efficiency of buildings, but that can also potentially be used as, again, resources in these grid modernization efforts. The two big policy issues on the horizon have to do with compliance requirements associated with the states moving towards increasing, primarily through building code Title 24, also known as Title 24, the efficiency, the energy efficiency of buildings throughout California. In fact, under legislation passed a couple years ago, SB 350, there is a goal of all buildings in California getting to a place where by 2030, they are 50% more energy efficient than they were when that bill was passed in 2016. AB 802 is legislation that requires certain kinds of reporting and compliance around energy efficiency of building, including the conducting of benchmarking as to the current status of those buildings. But the area that I want to talk about most in terms of the commercial issue is this whole Internet of Things idea. And the concept here is that with some of the advanced data capabilities. It can be your dryer, it can be your water heater, it can be your heating system. You can get both greater efficiency in terms of the use of energy and potentially lower cost on that kind of equipment. At the same time, with the new kinds of communication devices that are available, for example, a number of the new electric water heaters, known as which is a heat pump technology, which takes ambient air and as a way of being more efficient around heating up the various coils that heat up your water. Those are devices that truly can be thought of almost like a battery, as a storage device, in the sense that if it is internet connected to either your utility or through a third party that is organizing that resource and aggregating that along with many other resources in its providing that capacity to the local utility or distribution system operator, you can decide to heat that water at a time of day that is beneficial in terms of what the grid is looking for. In other words, storing energy in the form of that hot water such that you don't have to put energy into that hot water heater at a time when the grid, for example, is under stress. And at the same time, you can also conceivably, with those controls, time the discharge of that water and require more energy so that, again, you can load it from that standpoint. So these are some of the things that are coming down the pike. Most of the leading providers are building into their devices these communication and control capabilities, and in anticipation that this approach for meeting the grid needs is going to be increasing. And again, under each of these circumstances, the notion is that the owner, the homeowner or the building owner, will share in the benefit with whatever developer that is providing this. So for example, at a meeting last week that Southern California Edison held in Ventura County and in Santa Barbara County, they invited both developers and a number of local government and school business officials, essentially to bring them together to get them to connect to each other around forming partnerships that could then be used for when the RFP comes out in June to bring forward a list of buildings and resources that could provide these grid benefits. And again, the question being how much of the revenue that the developer is going to get gets shared with the site host or the building owner, be it a city or school district or community college or whatever. Negotiating those contracts, making sure they're done in a way that meets, is fair to the public sector agencies is sort of what my company and frankly the local government commission I know is trying to promote, is make sure that the markets that are developed there are fair to local government and other public agencies. And so any of you who want to sort of dig down into that, we can certainly talk about it. I attended a local government commission workshop this weekend up in Yosemite, where we had a number of presenters. I presided over a panel that talked about what are some of the best practices that cities, counties, and others are using to get ready for entering into these kind of partnerships and providing these opportunities. And I've been talking up to now primarily about the economic benefit, but there is also obviously the policy agenda in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The last issue, though, that we do need to talk about in this area of connecting devices is the telemetry security issues. When you talk about having communications between devices and the grid, you create this risk potentially of folks who may not be looking out at the best interests of hacking those devices to do something. And many of you may have heard about a report that came out last week that apparently, state actors had in fact invaded some of the networks that the utilities around the country have in their communication with their various devices and resources. So there's a heightened awareness right now around that cybersecurity issue, and those issues are going to have to be, definitely addressed when we talk about going from, again, a very centralized system to one that is much more distributed and decentralized all over the place. So a third area that we want to talk about today is the electrification of transportation, and this is an area where the general, when you talk to industry people, when you talk to policy people, both who are working on these issues in Sacramento and who are working on these issues in Washington, that we have hit that inflection point where people are no longer talking about if we're going to move towards electrification of transportation, but when and how fast. And there's some who think it's going to be a whole lot faster than many of us think about. In terms of specifically public transit, there's been a number of developments in the last couple years. The California Air Resources Board has recently significantly increased its HVIP incentive program for public transit and also actually available for school transit. They've increased those incentives to the point where, in many cases, in terms of the capital cost, with those incentives, you can basically purchase a electric bus, at pretty much the same cost as a traditional diesel bus. The Prop 39 program is going to be putting $75 million into school bus transportation, primarily electrification of school bus transportation this year. And so a lot of money is now being moved towards that area. The operating costs, some of the numbers around operating costs are very attractive also, both from a maintenance standpoint and from a fueling standpoint. And so with in particular, the Prop 39 program, there's going to be funding for the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, as well as the buses, and money for training of staff to learn how to do the servicing of this new technology. But the big question in the minds of many transit operators, there are still limits on range of buses. And can these buses be as flexible in terms of some of the kinds of routing that both public and school transportation agencies require? So those are questions that are still, in the mix. And while there are technologies that have very wide, much greater ranges than others, the dominant technologies right now have some of those limitations. And so those are the issues that people are looking at. In terms of EV cars and infrastructure, again, one of the questions is, chicken and egg. Is there enough charging infrastructure in place to motivate people and get them beyond whatever anxiety they may have about running out of fuel? As somebody who has been driving electric cars for a number of years, it's you change your habits and it works out. And when I have to do a long distance trip, like I went to Yosemite, I rent a car. But in terms of public agencies, as part of both their desire to reduce their carbon footprint, having a strategy around EV cars, not just in the transit side, is becoming a increasingly important direction. And there again are programs, multiple programs out there. Utilities are making big investments, as are some of the different CCAs in these infrastructure. So, for example, a number of the CCAs are actually giving away level 2 charging to any of their customers. Basically, the customer just has to install it, because the device is being connected, again, through a Wi-Fi connection or a cell connection, such that CCA can also communicate with that battery. And in the same way we were talking about the electrification of everything, or Internet of Things, with washers and hot water heaters and so forth, there's a lot of attention to having that same capability in terms of the grid support and grid modernization for electric vehicles, because they are basically batteries that move around. And there are these vehicle to grid or vehicle to building capabilities of these cars and the charging infrastructure that with a communication device would allow a CCA or the utility for that matter to either load up the battery or discharge from the battery in ways that make the grid more efficient and more effective and at a lower cost. And so programs are starting to roll out mostly on a pilot basis, but we see that's accelerating over the next couple of years, where again, a local government or a CCA could be the aggregator of these resources and share in the revenues with various vendors or developers around providing that resource to the grid. At the same time, by having that additional revenue, create incentives for people to move towards electric transportation faster than otherwise. This is also the last piece here, going back to the resilience, is that we are working with a number of jurisdictions who are looking at transit buses, electric transit buses, as being mobile backup resources. So for example, let's say you have a microgrid with a solar and battery capability at a operations center, and you have a two-way charging infrastructure. The bus could conceivably get power from that facility and travel to sites that have a two-way charger for critical loads, providing backup for critical needs at a nursing home or a dispatch center or a police station or whatever around the community. So there's a number of different ways in which the electrification of transportation can meet not just the grid modernization needs, but again, these resilience needs that many communities are looking at. And we're going to get into that here in a little bit. Let me pause real quickly. I've been sort of going on here for about 25 minutes and see if there are any questions up to this point, Carrie, that you think I should jump in on, because I haven't seen anything come up on the screen.
No, there's no questions right now, Rick.
Okay. Well, please feel free.
We just got one that came in. So, okay. With the proliferation of battery usage, is some type of a disposal program for these batteries at the end of is there some type of disposal kind of process or program for these batteries?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different things. There is actually, and I don't have the bill in front of me, but there's legislation this year to set in California for certain kinds of standards around the recycling of batteries and battery components. One of the interesting things about batteries, though, is that, again, there's going to be, we're not quite there yet, although it's coming soon, what we call a secondary market. Because let's say right now let's say you put a stationary battery in for demand savings or for resilience or for rate arbitrage, something we talked about at part one of this session. And again, I should say, if you guys haven't, you might want to get the recording that Carrie has up on the website of part one. We went more deeply into battery and solar and other technologies. But generally, these batteries are warranted under these stationary models, for a building for 10 years. Now, just because it's warranted for 10 years doesn't mean the battery doesn't still have value after that 10 years. It may not have enough to make it worthwhile to not have it replaced at that building, but then those batteries can go to a secondary market. There's, I'm aware of, I don't have deep knowledge in this, but I know that there's a market where, for example, data centers, buy up some of these used batteries, tie them together and have them as a backup resource, because even a battery at 20% of its original capacity is still valuable, particularly if you can buy it for a fraction of the cost of a new battery. So there is the secondary use, and then there is the recycling. I'm not personally familiar with all the physics behind that recycling, but I do know that that is a capability that the industry is got in place. Any other questions right now?
Yeah. So you may get to this one later in the webinar, but when do you anticipate the Prop 39 program for electric buses to be rolled out?
I am going to get that. The we have an estimated date of June 1, but that could always be moved back depending on a number of factors, including they're still trying to figure out, I'll talk about this later, how much money is available for this program, and I'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to move to the next set of slides, which are very important. So we've talked about energy efficiency and the Internet of Things connection there, and to grid modernization and so forth. We've talked about the electrification of transportation and the use of car batteries for other purposes other than transportation. But the other big push that's coming is for electrification of heat, hot water, and other devices is to get away from the use of natural gas, otherwise known as methane. As I mentioned before, a big push under SB 350, which increased the renewable portfolio standard and also pushed for the increase in efficiency of buildings by 2030. The underlying motivation there is to get carbon out of our economy, decarbonization. And one of the issues is that natural gas, as a greenhouse gas, in terms of its effect on global warming, is 80% stronger, more powerful than CO2 in those GHG effects. Well, one of the sort of policy dilemmas is that, at least at the federal level, there's been a big push, even during the Obama administration, to shut down coal-fired power plants and switch to gas-fired power plants as the bridge to eventually a fully clean energy economy. Because gas, with all the fracking technology that's come on in the last 10 years to release much more gas than what was previously thought to be available, lowering the cost of that resource, and what was assumed to be the ability to have fewer emissions from a gas plant versus a coal plant. That's been the push for the last few years. But research that has come out in the last couple years, and actually the city of San Francisco is doing some very interesting research on this in their Department of the Environment, is that while, yes, once the fuel gets to a device, it is, definitely better than a device that's powered by coal, a coal-based electricity. The transport of gas from where it's pulled out of the ground to where it's used apparently may have a much higher rate of leakage, meaning that the pipes and the devices from the well to the distribution center to the pipeline to the distribution level, from the street to your house, that the amount of leakage that occurs may be significantly higher than what the industry and various regulatory agencies had previously believed. That some recent studies seem to be indicating that the leakage level can be as much as 12%. That's the high end, but that even at the sort of mid-range of 3 to 5%, because of that much, much higher greenhouse gas effect of gas, it is significantly worse than if you had produced that energy through the coal-fired power plant and delivered it in the form of electricity. Now, let me just put a big caveat. This is data and research that is still under review, but if it is validated through further study that these leakage rates are really as high as they are, we're going to see policy direction to move towards fuel switching. In other words, away from gas for all these various devices, and frankly, for electricity generation, at a much more rapid rate than what is currently underway. The second thing that's pushing this is that there are also recent studies that seem to indicate that the health effect of gas, particularly from gas stoves, which everybody loves to cook on gas. You tell people, I'm going to take away your stove and you're going to have to use electric, and you might get a revolution, including my family. But in fact, in a Lawrence Berkeley Lab study of 6,000 homes, they found that the air quality when that gas stove is not being actively vented with a hood is as much as 10 times worse than the worst day in the winter when there's an inversion in, say, the Central Valley or the LA area. We're talking about carbon monoxide, we're talking about NOx, we're talking about formaldehyde, particulate matter, et cetera. And so again, these are early studies, but if this turns out to be true, there's going to be, again, a bigger push both from the GHG effect and second from the health effect for this fuel switching from gas water heaters to heat pumps, from gas heating systems to, again, heat pump heating systems, from gas stoves to electric stoves, from gas dryers to electric dryers. Now, one of the problems or one of the obstacles to that is that there is actually, the cost of gas is still relatively low compared to the cost of electricity, even when going head to head in terms of, the most efficient devices. And so, and the capital cost of, for example, buying a hot water heater that is electric versus electric heat pump versus a typical gas heater, again, more expensive. What we're actually working on is, modeling what is the life cycle benefit of these devices, particularly when you factor in some of the new revenue streams that I talked about earlier. Having these devices connected and being able to get paid to be available for grid modernization, and in a more esoteric usage for, say, a CCA or any other kind of load-serving entity as a device that they can use through these controls to do what's called load shifting or load shaping to smooth out the use of electricity in their territories to make it cheaper for them to buy on the wholesale market electricity to serve their ratepayers. So to the extent that those economic benefits through non-behind the meter, the typical hot water or typical heating, but for these other grid and other benefits, if you add those revenue streams in, you look at the life cycle cost, hopefully we're going to be able to get to a place where we can show people that this fuel switching isn't just a good thing from an environmental and health standpoint, but it's also a good thing from a commercial or economic standpoint. But the big, again, as I referenced earlier, the big technology issue is, the communication of these devices and the security issues that come with that. And so that'll be one of the gating functions as to how fast and how how pervasively this fuel switching is going to occur. But there are organizations that are already going down this path. So, for example, MCE, which is the CCA covering Marin County, most of Napa, most of Contra Costa County, and the city of Benicia, is going to be rolling out a program pretty soon to provide incentives to their customers to do some of this fuel switching. And one of the ways they're going to do that is through bulk buying programs, where they're going to hopefully reduce the cost for their customers by allowing them to enroll in a program where, as part of a bulk purchase, they're able to reduce that capital cost, that upfront cost of those devices. And there are a number of other CCAs who are considering this kind of approach to help move this fuel switching thing along. This is just a slide that I actually lifted from a presentation that I heard this weekend at this local government commission conference, and it's pretty interesting. I mean, basically, it confirms what I was saying earlier, which is that gas appliances in buildings are responsible for 25% of the NOx in California. I always thought it was cars. I mean, here we go. And again, criteria pollutants from incomplete combustion, especially from gas stoves, also have a significant input on, the air quality and pollution. And you can see, on that map where that happens. So, given that huge amount of GHG impact from California buildings, and a lot of that is now coming to be associated with the use of gas, we do expect in response to this data that there's going to be more effort to, again, support that fuel switching. And this chart just shows you in terms of how gas is consumed, the big number is associated with water heaters and then space heating. So while the stove, as I was mentioning earlier, is not a big consumer of gas, because of the way that the gas is used, those health effects are really the key to thinking about making that switch. And here's just a list of some of the communities, some of the public agencies. I mentioned the Marin MCE one. Sonoma Clean Power is putting, I heard, in the multi-millions money into supporting homeowners who lost their homes during the fires into zero net energy buildings, doing consumer education and outreach. You can see some of the other programs. One of the most significant is that Los Angeles, is pretty much put a line in the sand that said that they want to reduce their GHG goals significantly, with a big part of that being getting rid of gas. And they've directed their own utility, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, to come up with strategies for doing this fuel switching as quickly as possible. Okay, we just have a couple more topic areas. We have about 15 minutes or so, so I'm gonna go through these relatively quickly. One of the areas that, as I mentioned earlier, the example at this Monterey school district is, to say, look, we are seeing an increasing frequency and magnitude of natural/climate disasters. I don't call them natural disasters anymore. They're climate disasters. Now, there are also, besides fires and floods, there are seismic events that we have in California where we have risk of. But, it is nationwide, the frequency of these disasters is what our governor is calling the new normal. In 2017, of the 3,200 counties nationwide, 800 counties had a disaster event that led to a designation by the federal government of a disaster zone qualifying for benefits. 25% of all counties in the country had some kind of event that allowed them to qualify for disaster assistance. So we're not talking about something that happens here, there, it happened, down south or over there. This is going to be happening more and more frequency. And so public agencies are increasingly looking at how do we prepare for that? And one of the ways that they realize they need to prepare is to make sure that when and if the grid goes down associated with these disasters, are the critical services that are needed able to be available? And one of the methods that people are using is many public agencies have solar at schools, at community buildings, at police stations or operations center. By attaching a battery to that solar, by putting in a microgrid controller and other devices to allow you to island that facility from the grid if it goes down, you now have the capability to continue to provide essential public services. And so, it is something that you're going to be seeing more and more of. California's Energy Commission has recently published what they call the Microgrid Roadmap, and even more recently, about a month ago, released the results of a competitive grant solicitation totaling about $44 million that involved various local governments, tribes, schools, and so forth, proposing different methodologies for implementing microgrids to help the state learn about what kind of policy and what kind of funding might it need to accelerate the availability of this technology, the microgrid technology, to accelerate its adoption throughout the state. And again, I keep banging the drum here, but there is also a connection to the grid modernization effort. in that to the extent that you have a microgrid that links up your solar, your battery, your hot water, your heating devices, all the different devices together, you now have the ability to have a much more diverse set of resources in a more flexible way that you can sell into these emerging markets for distribution services that the utilities and distribution system operators are putting out there. The reason I keep saying distribution service operators is the major utilities serve a lot of California, but there's also Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which is doing a lot of work around promoting these kinds of distributed energy resource approaches to managing their delivery system. LADWP, as I mentioned earlier, is being directed on this. So a lot of public utilities, municipal utilities, are also going down this path. So, those of you who are in those territories, I encourage you to connect to those entities to see where they're going and what programs they might want to partner with you around in terms of those needs. And then our last topic is Prop 39. Again, what's going on, as of February 28th, the 5-year Prop 39 program sort of officially closed the gate. It was as of that date that schools throughout California had to submit their energy expenditure plans in order to qualify to access their allocations of this funding, this 5-year funding, which totaled across the state somewhere in the neighborhood of around $1.6 to $1.7 billion over that 5-year period. The quote-unquote new program is really what I would call the leftover program. Any money that was allocated but not qualified for in terms of one of these energy expenditure plans, any money that was left over from that original program is going to be available over the next year or so in potentially 3 ways. The first $75 million of any leftover money is going to be devoted to, as I mentioned earlier, a clean bus program. And presumably, and again, this is a projection, but it's not been, confirmed yet, the goal was to have by June 1, the rules and the guidelines for how that money was going to be spent and distributed released. There were a number of workshops in February that the CC conducted, gathering input on how they should approach this, and they extended the comment period to March 7th. They're digesting those comments as we speak, and my guess is within the next 4 to 6 weeks, we'll come out with the next iteration of that timeline. There also is, so the first $75 million for clean transportation with an emphasis on electrification of school buses. The second the next chunk of money, up to $100 million in what's called ECA loans, which are zero interest loans for energy purposes, and then whatever might be remaining for grants. And given what data has been put out there, probably less than about $50 million. So nothing near to the $300 to $400 million that has been going out every year for the past 5 years. Now, what as I mentioned here in this slide, these loans and these grants are not going to be distributed on a formula to every district in California. They're likely going to be distributed through more of a competitive solicitation process that waits for energy savings and energy costs and cost savings, but also includes disadvantaged community and or free and reduced program, lunch program metrics. Poverty of school districts or the population they serve may also be part of the evaluation of applications for this money. And there'll probably be a much tighter, at least from the language that's gone out, a tighter look at are the savings projections that are being put in these proposals backed up by good data. The previous program, the level of analysis around savings was not as rigorous, I would say, as what is likely to come with this next iteration of the program. And the last point I would make is there are groups that are advocating for an extension of the program beyond this period with new money. And when I say new money, many of you may know that the funding source for Prop 39 is from the closing of a out-of-state corporate tax loophole. And over the last 5 years, that closing of that loophole has generated about $3.5 billion to the state, half of which, or $1.7 billion, has gone to what we know of as the Prop 39 program. But that revenue source is still out there. And so the legislature and the governor are going to be asked this year, why not just continue doing this? The program has been successful. Why not continue funneling at least half of that money into this as a continuing program? Because there's many more needs than what the first half of the program came up with. Whether and how successful those advocacy efforts will be, I can't tell you. But if you're interested, one of the leading proponents there is an organization called the School Energy Coalition. And if you're interested, I can connect you up with them. That's something that I can get you involved in. All right, so that's our Prop 39. We have about 10 more minutes, maybe 8 more minutes for questions. I see one question that Carrie put up here that said, in many rural areas, natural gas is not available and they rely on propane. How does the fuel switching story play out regarding propane? And do you know if propane presents similar health effects as natural gas? I don't have the specifics on the health effects of propane. My guess is that it's not going to be a whole heck of a lot better because the underlying chemistry is not all that different. But don't quote me on that. It's interesting in terms of, you're absolutely right. There actually is a specific proceeding by this California Public Utilities Commission called Disadvantaged Communities 2, which is trying to address this issue of lack of gas availability in rural areas, particularly poor rural areas in the San Joaquin Valley. And because what ends up happening for many of these small communities that don't have gas service is they often are communities with homes and buildings that are very poorly insulated and have very inefficient heating capabilities. We're talking about space heaters and so forth often. And so the electricity bills for many of these communities are through the roof. And so the CPUC is trying to come up with alternative models for providing energy to these communities, potentially things like community solar facilities and community battery facilities paired with solar to both reduce the cost of electricity for those communities and reduce the carbon footprint of those of that energy source. So that would, if you're interested in that and seeing how that proceeding is going to go along, a proposed decision was released about 2-3 weeks ago, and so it would provide incentives for creating some of these different models for serving rural communities to help them with more energy efficient electric devices and cheaper sources of electricity in those areas. So I can fill you in on that if you have some questions about it. The next question I have here, let me just scroll down. The next question says, leftover Prop 39 funds such as the ECA loans would still be only available to schools, correct? Versus municipalities too. Based on the fact that, let's put it this way. On the conversations and meetings that I've been to, sponsored by the CEC, they are not talking about these funds being for anything other than for schools. There is an ECA loan program which doesn't provide zero interest loans, but provides 1% interest loans for municipalities, for cities and other municipalities. The funding source for that is primarily, it's a revolving loan fund. As loans get paid off, more money comes into that. There hasn't been any new additional allocation to that fund in a couple years, but it's certainly possible that there could be new allocations there. So if you have a project that you think might qualify, and I'm talking to now the folks from municipalities, you should definitely consider that program, that 1% program. And again, we've done a number of those for our clients. If you're interested, I'm glad to help you with that, or I'm sure Carrie has some other resources for helping people scope out putting together those loan applications. The application process itself is not significant. There is a data or analytic piece to show that you can do the payback on these projects within the economic useful life of the measures that you're putting in. And that takes a little bit more sophisticated modeling, but it is a good program. And if you have a project that you think might qualify, you should definitely look into that. Okay, let's see. I don't see any other written questions up here. We only have a couple more minutes. Carrie, do you have anything else that anybody's put over the transom?
No, no more questions at the moment, Rick. I think that, oh, here's one more.
Okay.
Oh. I think she may be typing it.
Okay. Well, let me just give everybody a couple more seconds. We'll just do some quick wrap up. I think the contact information for me and for Carrie, you'll be sending that out as part of the recording. Is that right, Carrie?
Yeah, I'll be sending a recording out and copies of the slides.
Okay. Well. I forgot to put my contact information on this slide deck. I put it on part one. I'll resend it to you with the contact information if anyone wants to get in touch. I had about a half a dozen people call me with follow-up questions after the last session, and I'm glad to. If I know the answer, I'll give it to you. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I don't know, and here's where you might want to go.
Excellent. Okay, so the question here on the graph that broke down household national gas or natural gas by appliance, what was that data based on, and how might it differ for the Bay Area in comparison to other areas?
You know, this was a slide that was put together by an analyst from the Sierra Club, and I don't have on this slide the reference, but let me get the reference from her, and we'll send that out as one of our follow-ups.
Cool, that'd be perfect. All right, I think that will do it for today. And like Rick said, if you have any more,
we got one more minute. We got one more minute in.
The question says, why is there no promotion of solar thermal?
You know, that's a really good question. Because there really are pretty significant incentives still out there for solar thermal. And for those of you who don't know what we're talking about solar hot water, right? Where you have a different kind of panel, so to speak, generally rooftop, where you're using the sun to heat or preheat water in combination with an existing hot water system to reduce energy use. It's been really interesting. I won't pretend to be strongly familiar with this program because the clients that we've had, it just hasn't been a very feasible alternative economically. But this is one of those programs that has really good incentives, particularly for household use, and the money's just not being taken up. People are not investing, and I don't have a good answer as to why that happened. I know that in the first wave of solar back in the Carter administration days, there were a lot of horror stories around solar thermal systems that failed, resulting in roof leak issues. That technology has come a long, long way, and it's much more reliable. But part of the issue is, again, natural gas prices, I will use the term, are artificially very low. And so the economics around doing solar thermal, in terms of replacing, say, a certain amount of gas energy with the solar energy, just aren't that strong relative to how, for example, solar electricity versus electricity provided by your utility, where the economics have historically been very strong. So that's speculation as to why you haven't had the same level of uptake. It's just not the emphasis really is, let's not make this complicated. We have these new electric heat pump water heating systems that are very strong and reliable, and they get us off of gas. That's why I think the policy direction is more in favor of that than the solar thermal. But that's speculation. Okay, we got one more question, came in at 2 o'clock, and I think we're going to have to wrap up here. What do you think about renewable natural gas? So just to be clear, just because the source of renewable gas is not a fossil fuel, let's say it's methane that's produced by a landfill, doesn't mean that when that gas escapes, it doesn't have the same greenhouse gas impact. So the greenhouse gas impact piece is problematic. The other problem is that a lot of the devices that are the technologies that are set up to take natural gas, renewable natural gas, and again, I don't know the deep chemistry around this, is a little bit less clean, so to speak. It's got stuff that makes that interferes with some of the technology. But the reality is that we're not going to be able to switch, from electricity, gas use from all electric devices. So I've talked to people who've said, for example, large boilers, industrial boilers at factories and so forth, you're just not going to get there with electrification. So those are use cases where substituting renewable natural gas or biogas is significantly going to be a better option than fossil fuel-based natural gas. So again, not my deep area of expertise, but this is in terms of the technology people, the policy people, the business people I talk to and interact with. That's why there's just not as much emphasis on switching from fossil-based natural gas to renewable gas. Rather, the emphasis is on electrification. I think, Carrie, we've used up people's time. We're over the time there. So again, as Carrie said earlier, if you have follow-up questions, please get a hold of me. So anyway, I'm glad to follow up with anything you have.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Rick, for taking the time to join us today. It's very informative this past hour, and thank you to everyone who was able to participate, and thank you for all the great questions. We hope you found it worthwhile and valuable. And just as we said, the webinar recording and PDF of the presentation will be sent out in a few days via email. And this will conclude our webinar. Thank you again for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.